and you have the automobile industry then coming back. And I think just the other day I saw, there was something yesterday maybe, that unemployment in Michigan is on a very slow decline. But part of it is that the auto companies are now kind of been reorganized and are focusing on what the public wants, finally. And it's having a direct effect. I think I mentioned my sister-in-law works for Ford in the kind of the design area, and she got a whole program going for sustainable cloth and fabric for the cars, and now Ford is using that to out in California. They're starting with California, environmentally concerned, that we're now using reprocessed materials and so on. And I guess the thing is, you know, people in California are buying Fords because of the sustainability, etc. So companies are beginning to see, but she's had, and you know, since I've been familiar with the whole process, she had a great deal of trouble trying to get her coworkers and, you know, administrators and whatnot to go along with it. Now the company is, yes, this is the way to go, especially when they start seeing, you know, a financial return. Hey, that's great, you know, great job. So you're going to have the, you're going to have that type of thing beginning to develop in the state. So there we'll have to see where it's all going to, you know, at one point going to end. Or what the, not so much end, but what the future is going to be. The other, do you want to take, can we take a break here? Or?
Keep going for that.
Keep going? Okay, well, I was looking for the break. The other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of a kind of a major development in the state, and I was kind of somewhat half-heartedly joking about coming to class and lecturing from Sunday's Detroit Free Press. And what you're going to have with Detroit today, you have a very difficult problem. But to go back to some of the origins, Detroit is going to boom with the, you know, with the, well, it goes into a decline in the Depression, but then World War II comes, the post-war years, the 60s and so on. But then in the 1960s, you have the development of the interstate system. And the interstate system is developed under President Eisenhower. The idea was, it was if you look at the reason for creating the interstate system, was for national security, that we could get troops to the Canadian border as quickly as possible, or to the Mexican border, or to the Florida border as the Cubans are coming across the Florida Strait or something. But the secondary role of it, which is the more important role, is that when it's not being used for national security, it's used by everybody else. So what's going to happen is the interstate system develops in the 1950s, and Detroit is going to be connected. The first part will be, what is it, I-94, that will be Detroit, Ann Arbor, sort of along that route, Kalamazoo, and then Chicago. And then you have kind of the northern one, I-96, which I think takes you to Grand Rapids. So you have two major roads there, and then coming north and south will be the development of I-75. And then you have a lot of, you know, the subsidiary freeways and whatnot, I-696 and whatnot around Detroit. And so you're going to develop then in the beginning in the 50s and into the 60s, you develop these routes and if you look at a map, you have all of these routes kind of going out, radiating out of Detroit into the suburbs. Either a freeway, like I'm trying to think of what's the one up to, I guess it's 94, up to Port Huron. That'll take you up to Port Huron, through Detroit, Port Huron, then it switches around and goes over to Chicago. But what's going to happen is, and there had been kind of a, I don't know, an attitude by people in Detroit that when people that kind of irritated them arrived, get out. And so you're going to find that when immigrants began to come to Detroit and so on, a lot of the people kind of moved up to Grosse Pointe and those places out of the city. And in general, though, Detroit tends to be a blue-collar city. It's an industrial city. And even when you travel around Detroit today, and I'm not talking about the residential areas and huge areas of the city that are abandoned property and whatnot. But when you get to certain parts of the city today, heavy industry, railroad line, I mean, it's still industrial, railroad lines, big factories. When you go downriver to places like River Rouge, Wyandotte, Gibraltar, places like that downriver, it's still heavy industry. Zug Island, you know, sort of hell on earth, a huge steel mill complex that the public is not allowed to go onto the island, and there's all sorts of stories of the horrible pollution and whatnot. So you're going to find that Detroit is this big industrial center. I remember years ago we were talking with some of the faculty about, you know, are there any really good, outstanding, fancy restaurants in Detroit? And the faculty member I was talking, he said, why? They're all blue-collar workers, you know. They go to, you know, what's the place there? White Castle. You know, big meal at White Castle. Everybody comes out with a bag of little hamburgers. So you're going to have that situation. So with the development of the freeways, and then Detroit was also a city that began to develop shopping centers, you know, just outside of the downtown area. Now, in the old days, and some of you, anybody familiar with, who's from the Detroit, Metro Detroit here? One, that's all? Familiar with Hudson's department store? The big one downtown? You've heard about it. Okay. No, you wouldn't, physically you wouldn't be familiar with it, you're too young. But in downtown Detroit, you had this Hudson's department store, 25 stories tall. I mean, huge. It was like a giant vertical mall all around this one store. It didn't have separate stores, but it was all around this one store. People would, this was a place to go to. There was also another place called Crowley's, where you would meet under the clock. It was like an icon. You met under the clock at Crowley's. You know, where are we going to meet and so on? 3 o'clock under the clock. Okay, you knew exactly where to go, where to be, and so on. But the whole thing, and then today they still have the Thanksgiving parade, but in the old days, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people would line Woodward Boulevard, and then Hudson's would be the destination for Santa Claus and the whole thing. In Flag Day, they had the world's largest flag, and it would come down on the side of the building. When you're talking about a 25-story building, they had this huge flag. I think it started in World War I, and they would lower the flag on the building. But all sorts of fabulous stories about Hudson's department store, and other department stores. And even as a young person, you've probably heard about from relatives and so on, Hudson's department store. You mentioned that. Then Hudson's suburbanized. They started moving out and opened up branches. Then the downtown store went into a decline, and finally, about 1997, we got to see it, and a lot of people got a big surprise when it finally went, when they blew it up. And people were standing there, and all of a sudden they get hit with this mass of, God knows, I presume they pulled all the asbestos out, but they got hit with this mass of, you don't know what happens when you blow a building that way, but you're hit with this mass of dirt and dust and debris. I mean, heavy amounts of it. It's like you're in a dust storm. We were in the Ren-Sen, I think, in a General Motors area and so on. So we got to see it without getting covered with the dust. Anyway, that came down. But that had been, all of the downtown department stores had been gone because people had gone out to the suburbs. I guess I was in Hudson's probably the last time when it was actually, you know, you'd go there probably in the 1970s sometime. And then people just didn't go, you know, you went to the suburban stores and so on. So you're going to have this sort of decline, and then the thing that, and what happened was then people left because as the veterans came back and so on, they started living in the suburbs. That's where the cheaper housing was. You weren't going to stay in downtown Detroit where prices were expensive, land was expensive. So that will start the process. Then you had these freeways, and people started going out on the going out to the suburbs and so on. And for instance, today, if you want to see what has happened, you would go to Southfield, Michigan. And there's like a number of freeways come through the area. It's like a futuristic city almost. And then all around you are skyscrapers. And these would have been the skyscrapers if Detroit had continued. These skyscrapers would have been in downtown Detroit. And what happens when you look at downtown Detroit today, most of those buildings, substantial, beautiful buildings, were built in the Roaring '20s, in the 1920s, when things were booming. And then as the city dispersed itself, you now have, I think Southfield is probably the biggest development like that, where you have this kind of almost mega city that's developed, modern, futuristic city out there. Other places have developed, as well. And so you have this out migration. Then the big blow up will come with the infamous riots of 1967. And in the summer of 1967, there are going to be the riots that will take place that pretty much brings Detroit to its knees. National Guard, Army are sent in and so on. It's really bad. And that's sort of the end of Detroit. The migration is on. There's mass migration after that. Did your family leave Detroit at that time? Or did they live in Detroit?
They were in Radford.
Okay, had always been. Okay, but a lot of people, I'll ask people if there's a group of students in class, and they'll say, yeah, they moved out about 1968. We moved out to Redford or Livonia or wherever. So you have this out migration that takes place. Later on, you'll have in the 70s, 80s, you're going to have Mayor Coleman Young comes in, I think he's the first black mayor of Detroit. And he is pretty much anti-white, anti-suburb. And so then if there's, and plus you had all these white people out there that wanted nothing to do with black Detroit, and so he further irritates the situation. So if you're pulling people apart, now they're really coming apart. And Coleman Young is really, and familiar with the whole story. Somebody will say, no, he's a wonderful person, great, and so on, but does a job on Detroit, ruining any connection with the suburbs and the suburban population, which was never that excited. You know, they left Detroit for a reason. It was coming apart, and so on, and that continues the problem down to the present day. Down to the present day, if you read the newspaper, we're down to money in the bank for Detroit for 4 months. After that, bankruptcy. What? You know, the state of Michigan bails them out. What do you bail out? You know, you have no tax base. A lot of the city is empty. It's gone from a population of 2 million, close to 2 million, to 700,000. And I don't know if any other city is, I mean, cities have problems. I don't know if any other city has that type of problem. It seems to me, I don't know, insurmountable. Now, my other sister-in-law thinks that, I don't know, something's going to come out of the clouds, and Detroit is going to be the phoenix coming out of the ashes of the past and so on. I guess the question is, would I invest in Detroit? If I had the money, would I invest in Detroit? Would you invest in Detroit? And unfortunately, it would be no, unless I want to throw money away. But then I can pass it out to everybody here if I have it.
Somerset Mall is doing like programs where they bring their stores down to downtown Detroit
To try to bring them back. Yeah. Part of the problem with Detroit was that there was this migration, and so unfortunately the poor people that live in Detroit have no supermarkets to go to. There's like no where do you go shopping? A lot of these people don't have cars, so they're limited, and you do all of your heavy shopping at 7-Eleven. You know, number one, what is sold in 7-Eleven? You know, smoothie, sugar drinks, chips, hot dog. You know, what kind of food can you get at 7-Eleven? Limited, and now there has been, as people, but the sad part is things have gotten so desperate, that'd be probably the best word, so desperate that now people are saying, you know, maybe we should reinvest in Detroit. We should do something about the disaster that's there. And so they had various plans, but I haven't seen them take shape. But they were thinking of doing anchor communities, like around some major streets, and then try to get private developers to develop a restaurant, maybe to bring in a chain, and try to get something going in that area with the idea that this would spread and develop and develop and develop. But when you go through Detroit today, the parts that are still standing, a lot of it gets burned out periodically. You'll see these big, magnificent churches, beautiful homes, I mean, unbelievable homes and so on that are abandoned, or they're all burned out, and you're looking at the shell. So there could be a possibility of developing this, but again, are you going to, for instance, is everybody here going to say, I really want to move to Detroit? That's my plan. Now that's when a city is attracting people. Now you talk about like Chicago. Would you move to Chicago? Yes, people would. You go to downtown Chicago, things are happening, hotels, this, and this, department stores, Miracle Mile, blah, blah, blah. It goes on and on and on. And cities across the country, you have that. And that then attracts people. It attracts investments. People, want to be involved in that. So we're going to have to see what happens. But Detroit doesn't look, it's not healthy, financially healthy, and we'll see what happens. What was kind of interesting was there was a series of articles that were really quite telling, and it'd be nice, I wish there was some way to do this, but there was the articles were about, here's someplace, is that it? No. anyway, there were articles about an area in Detroit that had suffered from the riots in 1967, and they went back and they had I think there was like a week-long series about what happened in that one block since 1967 to, and I think the article was from 2001. What happened during that time? You know, house by house, just on one street block there. What happened over the years? And it's very, very interesting. Just this, and there you could see a very specific decline taking place. Now, in terms of some of the other developments that are going to, on a little more positive, well, I'm end totally negative here, but on a more positive spin, you're going to find that tourism, agriculture is a kind of a little, I don't want to say little known, but kind of ignored, because usually the automobile industry, and as I've been pointing out with World War II and so on, the industry in Michigan, and so as a result, the rather robust agricultural part of the state is ignored. That we're I think one of the leading producers of beans in the country, which we export a lot of them to Mexico. We're big. I think we're the major producer of tart cherries in the country, around the Traverse Bay area and so on. Big producer of sugar. Have become a big wine producer of non-alcoholic Welch's grape juice. So there's a whole agricultural part of the state, big into berries, blueberries and so on, raspberries, especially in West Michigan, but berries will grow just about any place. And the farther north you go, the more berries you get. So you have all of that whole aspect of the state. The other thing that they're talking about is agricultural tourism, where people would go and become, vegetable pickers for a weekend or something, living on the farm, or, as I've pointed out, becoming involved with the wine industry and going to a wine resort and spending the weekend there with good food, good wine, and so on. So you have that development. The other thing that has been promoted in the state, and it becomes somewhat cyclic, and that is the whole tourist industry. Michigan has thousands of miles of shoreline along the Great Lakes themselves, and then out in the interior lakes, and this is a tremendous resource, and a lot of people will come from like Iowa and are now buying property to be on the water. They can't get to the Pacific, to the Atlantic, but they can come to the Great Lakes. Well, it's not as salty, but we can't see the other side. Okay, we're happy. We look like we're on an ocean. I know I had friends from St. Louis, Missouri, and they bought a place up at Sagatuck in that area. They loved to be at the beach, the ocean, but it was going to be a long trip from St. Louis to Rehoboth Beach in Maryland. So they came north, a 400-mile trip. They're at the beach. So you find there are a lot of things that are going to attract people to Michigan. A lot of that goes back to the infrastructure for the tourist industry, goes back to the old Civilian Conservation Corps projects that developed the trails, the anti-erosion programs and so on, that allowed people to, or that created a very strong base for a state park system or a national forest system where people can go out and enjoy the woods. And then you have other developments that are going on here in terms of the federal government. pretty much since the 1930s, we've had a series of national parks in the state. You have Isle Royale National Park that was really kind of got going in the 30s, then it wasn't completed, and they finally dedicated it and opened it in 1946, 47 or so. Then you have the first National Lakeshore, Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore, which was in the 1960s. That's going to be followed by Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore comes about. In the 1990s, early 1990s, we have the Keweenaw National Historic Park up in the Copper Country, centered at Calumet, and that just back in October, Senator Levin was here, and they opened up the new visitors center up there, and that's, if you've never been up there, that's a worthwhile trip to the Copper Country is always worthwhile, but also to see some of the sites in that National Historic Site. Another development that took place in the early 90s was I think it's the Automobile Heritage Trail. And these are trails this is kind of an idea that's used around the country, developed by the National Park Service, but where you link, for instance, the automobile heritage of Southeast Michigan. And you develop a trail so that you would go from the Pequot plant where they invented the Model T to Highland Park to, then down to the River Rouge plant, over to Lansing and the Olds plant, and so on. And so if you follow this route, you would then get, you would get a totally educated to the development of the automobile industry. And these heritage areas are being developed. They're not national parks as such, but they're fostered by the National Park Service, who helps local communities develop them. And you'll find them around the country, and they can be kind of overwhelming. There's a lot to see, and some of it can be minutia, and you kind of wonder, do I really want to see another, the 10th Art Museum today? Now it's on the Heritage Trail. So you're finding this is there's some developments that are taking place around the state that will have an impact on the economy. However, you're getting back to, and at this point there's no magic industry that's coming, but there's more of an awareness about where the state has come from in terms of its economic development, social development, and what is going to have to be done in the future in terms of developing that, that industrial base. Because, see, Michigan also got involved with the Rust Belt. Everything's dying here, and then people migrated out, especially in the 1980s. People were going to to Alaska to work in the pipeline. They were going to Houston to work in the oil wells there, and there was this big out-migration of people. And some of that has been stemmed now, and there are some developments taking place. So at this point, we'll have to see what, you have the background now. You read the paper and say, oh, I see where that came from, and okay. But it's kind of an open question as to what's going to happen, especially for a place like a large city like Detroit, and then would that have an impact on the rest of the state, which it would have. So anyway, that's where we're at this point. I'm done.